Now you are the host,
All
and
right.
the focus is on you. The stage is yours. You are the, I mean,
All right. Sure.
person the students will be looking at. So yes, please go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much. So, thank you so much for having me this evening. And this is a topic which probably I can say now I have been researching probably for more than a decade, especially on the relations between India and ASEAN. And then finally, with my PhD, I focused on looking at ASEAN and the Southeast Asian regional dynamics. So the task which I suggested as a topic today is something which probably would be very interesting for us to look at, and that is on India-ASEAN relations. But purely not from the more studied economic or the political interactions or the regional interactions. But largely, I would like to focus today on placing the emphasis on the geopolitical interactions and how geopolitics is actually shaped by India's relations or India's interactions with the ASEAN organization. So, as students who are studying foreign policy, India's relations with ASEAN are a key moment in terms of the establishment of relations between India and India's post-Cold War relations, I could say. So these relations were formed over a point of time under what I could best characterize as a strenuous circumstance and conditions of the end of the Cold War and 1990s. As we are aware as students who have studied Indian economy, Indian history, we know that this was also the era when India restructured its economy, and we led or we moved towards the economic liberalization as a policy. So within the framework of liberalization, we often see that as a domestic component of policy emphasis for India, but more so an important strategic move within the opening up of India's economy was to relook or to revisit the global economic and political interaction models which we had in during the Cold War, which was based on the based more towards and focused more towards the Soviet Union, and also the collapse of the bipolar system of competition between the United States and the Soviet Union led for India to actually reconceptualize its economic engagement and foreign policy. And then we ended up with, in the early part of the 1990s, with India's Look East policy, which formed the emphasis or which formed the basic bedrock for India's relations with the ASEAN organization. So, if we can characterize this relationship, it can probably be seen as one of the most successful foreign policy initiatives after the Cold War, which is even functioning even today. So, for instance, if we look at many of the policy initiatives, we often look for continuities within foreign policy functioning. But interestingly, if we look at the post-Cold War foreign policy initiative, we see that the Look East policy, and now which has been termed as the Act East policy from 2014, has been continuous despite and also throughout different types of different political parties coming into power. So that itself is a successful continuity of a foreign policy initiative. So, if we characterize the relations with Southeast Asia, they were premised under India's Look East policy, as I said, and the foundations were based on the concept of at least placing ASEAN, the organization, which represented most of the developed parts of Southeast Asia in the 1990s, centrally to this initiative of engaging with India's neighborhood. So a brief bit of history is extremely important before we talk about the 1990s. And the history of India's relations with Southeast Asia were quite complicated. So if you look at the relations with Southeast Asia initially after India's independence, so the relationship was more centered on India's relations with Indonesia, and through various different ideological tones such as the non-alignment or decolonization as initiatives in the early part of after India's independence. So while regional structures had emerged based on the Cold War interactions between major powers and regional countries, we see the emergence of organizations such as military organizations such as SEATO, which is a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization in the 1950s, and or more regional organizations in nature focusing on Southeast Asia, such as the Association of Southeast Asia, which was the organization which came before ASEAN in the 1960s. So ASEAN then in August 1967 was mooted as a regional initiative and was led by the formation of was formed by 5 countries, which was Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Thailand. So if you look at these 5 countries, they formed ASEAN in August 1967. Now, where was India located? As we see that India initially had very good ties with Southeast Asian countries, at least the major powers such as Indonesia. But due to the change in the ideological setting over the Cold War and domestically also changes in these countries, India and the countries in Southeast Asia, at least towards the 60s, saw each other on the different side of the ideological spectrum. While most of the countries which formed ASEAN were capitalist economies focusing more on export-oriented models of economic development, we see that India was more focused and closely aligned with the Soviet Union and the socialist bloc, and was also pretty much focused on import substitution as a model. So being on the other side of the ideological spectrum, India was kept much in the dark even then about the formation of ASEAN by Indonesia. So we see a successful high in terms of the relationship. And finally, in 1967, in fact, the Indonesian foreign minister was in New Delhi just the same month as when ASEAN was supposed to be launched in Bangkok. But India, there was no mention about, or there was no invitation for India to either be a member of ASEAN or even talk about, being told about ASEAN as an organization which was being formed close to India's neighborhood. So that is where the relationships, if we can categorize, between India and ASEAN was structured. But of course, like I said, 1990s, India changed its policy, and there were certain underlying reasons why India adopted this policy, and also Southeast Asian countries actually were keen on having India as a major player in the Southeast Asian geopolitics. One was the major reason was economic cooperation. As you know, India's economy was not in a very favorable position in the early part of the 1990s, and India needed to actually shift in terms of its economic model towards aligning with the capitalist bloc or the unipolar structure which had developed after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. So if we categorize this, the Southeast Asian countries with which India had historically quite strong relations, especially relations between relations based on cultural and civilizational exchanges. If you see many of the cultural similarities between countries of Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia, or for that matter, the Indian heritage, which is there in Malaysia and Singapore, and also in the Indochina countries, you see that India has a lot of cultural similarities. But how did we want to translate or utilize this as a geopolitical benefit was sort of conceptualized through the economic model in terms of interacting with Southeast Asia through the Look East policy. So the first focus, if I can say, was to, as author Sunanda K. Dattare very famously titled his book, it was looking east to look west. So when we say looking east to look west, it is basically to slowly but steadily integrate with the Western style of economic development or diplomacy or others by closely integrating with countries with which India thought the economies could support, or the other modes could be more compatible in terms of the cooperation which is there. Now, the second element in terms of the characteristics and features of India's interaction with ASEAN can be sort of looked at from the defense cooperation and coordination point of view, and India's ambition at the longer term in terms of the strategy to play a major role in the security calculus in the region. So initially with the Look East policy, we focused on the economy, but during the mid 1990s, as an evolution, we also saw the development of maritime relations in terms of exercises. The Simbex exercise between Singapore and India in 1994 was the first maritime exercise India had with a country in the region, which later on subsequently followed with defense cooperation relations with Malaysia, and then subsequently with Indonesia as well. So this the third was to look at the multilateralism aspect of it. Um, while engaging bilaterally was an important aspect which formulated relations, multilateralism was a mode of development or cooperation which was developed throughout the 80s and the 90s, which we see. We saw the emergences of several trade blocs, such as APEC, for instance. It was now India's opportunity to plug into these multilateral structures in the 1980s, including the one focusing on trade and security in the neighborhood. And of course, with the changing security environment, if we can see, one of the other reasons was that India wanted to also balance as much it wanted to play a major role in the security of the then Asia Pacific conceptualization, which had emerged in the part of the 80s and continued through the 90s. So if we saw the underlying reasons, we can sort of chart some characteristics and features of India's interaction with ASEAN. So it is basically a relationship which is structured or centered on trade and subsequently on security and the strategic partnerships which were established. So if you draw a network with India as the central in the mode, and you draw lines which radiate outside in terms of the relationship, you see that India has practically established major relationship with ASEAN as a central factor. There is also a structural element reflecting in the formulation of through the formulation of what we can now term as the Act East policy. So there is a structure, there is a proper policy initiative, and there is a proper engagement mode through which India can collaborate with this region. And there were also several geopolitical factors which were decisive into ASEAN admitting India into its partnership framework. As we go into the evolution, one interesting thing and we would realize is that ASEAN has several levels with which countries interact with the organization, and the highest level, of course, is the summit level or the strategic level partnership. But here, if you can see, in 1996, India became what was known as a full dialogue partner with ASEAN. And this was even before China became a full dialogue partner with ASEAN. So here you see that there was an effort in the 1990s to balance and bring India very much into the framework. So how do we characterize the evolution of the partnership? So if you look at the economic reasons for the engagement through the multilateral framework in the 1990s, we can see that, as we discussed earlier, there was a growing importance of the ASEAN organization within the Asia Pacific regional frameworks. And also multilateralism and trade, especially with the negotiations at the WTO, the 1990s, became very important for us to understand. So after 1992, India became a sectoral dialogue partner, which is the first level of integration or relationship with ASEAN. So 1995, India became a full dialogue partner with ASEAN. 96, India joined the security-based interactive mechanism known as the ASEAN Regional Forum. 2002, India became a summit level partner of ASEAN, and 2005, India became a member of the ASEAN Plus extended regional grouping known as the East Asia Summit. And in 2008 to 10, we saw India signing the free trade agreements with the ASEAN grouping as well. So if you look at the evolution, it has been a good more than a decade in terms of building this comprehensive partnership and a relationship with the ASEAN grouping as well. So, like any policy initiative, there are often we have to often test the success, at least qualitatively, of whether this policy initiative has been successful or not for the organization. And if we look at certain benefits India has derived from the policy, um, of course, there are challenges which we would also discuss. So some of the benefits which I can think of and I can put before you, and we can have a discussion, of course, after that as to how it has been successful or not as well. So one, we can say that the policy initiative has given India a say in terms of in matters in India's eastern neighborhood. So one major fault line in terms of India's interaction in the early part of the 1990s was in its relationship with Myanmar. And this was, of course, affecting the security in India's northeastern region as well. So we saw a change in policy, a shift in policy, which was formulated after 1996. And subsequently in the 2000s, we saw that India shifted in its policy with a focus from the focus on the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar to sort of more openly collaborating for its security interests with the Myanmar military government as well. So apart from this, there have been some factors, as we can see, in terms of India's admission into multilateral groupings such as the East Asia Summit. So India has, from the time in 1980s when India was not given the membership of APEC on asking, during probably the 2005, India was invited by Southeast Asian countries to join the East Asia Summit. So in a sense, India's active policy and a structured and concerted interaction has been to an extent helping India to enhance its relationship there. So it's a continuum of also a successful post-Cold War foreign policy, and it has also become a pillar of foreign policy outreach for different regions. Now you often talk about the Act. Why should India not have an Act West policy? The policy initiatives or the thought process need to be structured in terms of foreign policy outreach, and we can see that this also forms some sort of a blueprint in terms of how India can systematically expand its relations despite geopolitical pressures which might be there in this regional collaborations as well. It has also made India grow closer ties, if you can say, and the confidence amongst US and its allies. So if you remember, initially India started collaboration with the countries in the ASEAN grouping. But over a point of time, we see that this development has enhanced India's relationship with the United States as well, which is a key player in the now Indo-Pacific and then Asia-Pacific as well. And India has also benefited with increased trade and investment as in this region, and the shift in patterns of trade and cooperation in the region also signal that ASEAN actually benefits much more. If you look at the trade balance between India and ASEAN, most of the ASEAN countries have a trade surplus with India. So basically, the relationship does benefit ASEAN, but just that the volume of trade is not as much as other countries, or as much as how the whole potential is, despite India having FTA with ASEAN, which also is fraught with certain problems domestically as well. It has also improved a stronger focus, if we can say, for India's neighborhood engagement, and developed a new geopolitical imagination. So often, what happens is that we get stuck within existing or sort of imagine geopolitical conceptualizations, whether it is that India belongs to South Asia and to SAARC, and thus all the problems which come with the non-working of such organizations such as SAARC also are the baggage of India. So while drawing from the lessons of India's engagement with ASEAN, India has now started to also look at other other conceptualizations such as BIMSTEC, for instance, which is probably, if you can imagine, SAARC minus Pakistan and Afghanistan, and its ties with Southeast Asia. So this has also been a successful repurposing of geopolitics for India as well. And if you see the interactive nature, it contains economy, defense, and also reinforces the cultural and civilizational ties of India. And as we term the new interactive model of soft power in these countries as well. So, so what has been the perception of the India's Act East policy and its engagement with Southeast Asia? So, if you look at Southeast Asia, the image of India has definitely improved over a period of time. This can be qualitatively ascertained as well. But countries have often viewed India as being very confused in terms of its engagement with ASEAN. Some of the documents which have been leaked, diplomatic cables which were leaked, they often also said regional diplomats who had often said that India is half in and half out of ASEAN. So, in terms of a committed engagement, that might be a challenge. But India has benefited quite a bit, and its image has also improved over a point of time. Several countries in Southeast Asia have seen India as a probable balancer in terms of the overall geopolitics, not exactly in terms of focusing on India balancing China, which we often speak about, but India is seen as a balancer in terms of the overall relations between India, China, Japan, Russia, whichever country you can imagine which has substantial relations with the ASEAN grouping as well. But one of the major thoughts also revolve around the role of China and how China has been perceived, how China has perceived India's policy. And officially, we have also seen that China has perceived India's Look East or Act East policy as a policy of encircling China with its relations with Southeast Asian countries as well. And finally, I would just place like three major sections in my talk right now, and that is to touch upon the China factor in India-ASEAN relations. Now let's understand a few facts. We often hear India challenging China in Southeast Asia. No doubt, there are certain areas where India does have the benefit, and a substantial improvement in policy can affect China's standing in the region. But let's look at a few facts of China's interaction with Southeast Asia before we explore that aspect of India being a major player or the China factor in India-ASEAN relations. So China is ASEAN's largest trading partner, and the trade is almost, if I can say, close to 5 times, more than 5 times that of India's total trade with ASEAN as well. And it is also one of the largest investors in the region. We have also heard of China's mega projects under the Belt and Road Initiative in several countries. And it's also one of the top 8 distributors in the region, more specifically in the mainland Southeast Asian countries. That is Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and also Myanmar. So if you look at it, China figures in the top areas of controlling economy or trade, or for that matter, investments and aid as well in Southeast Asia. So, what are the key challenges on how ASEAN views India and China? So, ASEAN, and more importantly, some countries, they saw India and China um, as a balance or a key factor in relations of major powers and the stability in Southeast Asia. So Singapore's former Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong, very interestingly put it, where he said that India and China are like the two wings of the ASEAN or the Southeast Asian region's jumbo jet, right? You know, if even one wing fails, the economies could be adversely affected, or there could be conflict, they can be adversely affected. Of course, that was conceptualized probably in a very different time frame when China was much more economically and militarily weaker. But that gives us an understanding of how these countries view major power relations as a whole, and India and China more specifically as well. And ASEAN countries have also viewed India as a favorable country in balancing ties in the region, and a major country that will obviously also uphold the international rules-based order and the international system in the globe. Now, um, this was reflected in the State of Southeast Asia survey, survey which is conducted every year by the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies. And this is something which is probably indicative that despite Southeast Asian countries may not have confidence or much trade on where they really place India in terms of the geopolitics in Southeast Asia as well. So, what are the major challenges and the advantages? And this is where I conclude, which India has. Um, China has major disputes with Southeast Asian countries, and this has also affected ASEAN unity, or ASEAN countries have been repeatedly divided in terms of how they should approach or handle China's security excesses in Southeast Asia. And this could be one of the major areas where India can actually focus in terms of developing relations with countries which are becoming much more wary about China's increasing assertiveness or aggressiveness in Southeast Asia. The second is that the trade with China is often tilted in favor of China as opposed to how it is with India. So if we look at most of the countries, China has the advantage in terms of the trade. So if we are able to solve our outstanding issues in terms of engaging multilaterally through free trade mechanisms or bilaterally through our free trade agreements with Southeast Asian countries, we can find the right countries and how we can deal and also develop our trade relations with China as well, or with Southeast Asia as well, which can offset the relations with China. And we have majorly looked at mostly also substituting China's actions by cultural diplomacy, one, of course, selected infrastructure projects in countries such as Myanmar, for instance. and also other developments with the initiation of the Act East policy, which includes military and naval exercises, and now more recently the sale of defense equipments, which forms a major benefit. So, for instance, the sale of the BrahMos missile to the Philippines, it sort of signals a new step. And the sale of defense equipment enhances both, as we can say, a strategic and an economic value for India in the region. And I see that in this context, we can probably characterize how the relations between India and ASEAN are basically evolving. So I will, with these pointers, and I hope that I have been able to also provide various reasons based on which we can engage in a discussion. So this is where I conclude my talk, and I'll hand it over to the host to actually sort of shall we take questions or how we can move forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. Very well presented your views on India's engagement with ASEAN, what has been the policy in the past and how it has evolved, and what more we can have in our relationship with these Asian countries and all that. So now I will ask the students if they have any questions. They can go ahead and first let them introduce themselves and then they ask questions. Come on, be quick.
Good evening, sir. I am Riya Sharma and currently I am pursuing my master's in political science. Sir, Pakistan has been a major irritant in preventing India in developing a coherent neighborhood policy. And that is evident when we say that SARC has been hijacked by the India-Pakistan rivalry. Sir, ASEAN in this light has a major potential in furthering India's interest in Southeast Asia. But sir, here also, as you said, China is a bigger player. And realistically, it is difficult to match China. And Southeast Asian countries will continue to be under China's economic clout in the near future. So, sir, don't you think that instead of focusing on ASEAN, India can use forums like BBIN or the BIMSTEC in furthering its interest in Southeast Asia, because because in these forums, India enjoys a relatively, you can say, a more flexible position than in ASEAN.
Yes. So thank you. Actually, that's one of the developing focal points. So if you see with the initiation of India's neighborhood first policy, the approach was to sort of see if we can reset some type of relations with India's neighborhood here in South Asia. So like you rightly pointed out, in fact, the answer was in your question as well, if you noted it. And interestingly, if you see the development of BIMSTEC over a point of time and the priority given to BIMSTEC over SARC has been very evident. So yes, definitely, these fall under the categorization of sub-regional initiatives. So they often overlap in terms of membership or regions. So initially, at least, the India's need for interacting with ASEAN was important because India had to develop some sort of a relationship in projecting its power in the Asia Pacific region because of its ideological fallout during the Cold War. It was not able to develop these relations. So initially, at least, let's say till the 2000s or mid 2000s, India played a proactive role in terms of engaging ASEAN and going beyond even the ASEAN region into including relations with Japan, South Korea. And we see the second phase of India's Look East policy. And then, of course, later on, moving on to the Act East policy. So yes, definitely, the focus on sub-regional institutions will always be there. because India has the advantage, like you rightly said, being a major country which can drive the agenda. Now, the problem is that geopolitics often creeps into multiple forums as well. Now, if you see China's growing relations with let's take BIMSTEC itself for an example. China's growing relationship with Bangladesh, or China's growing relationship with Nepal, or China's growing, we have seen what's happened in Sri Lanka. So I need not say more. So China's relations with Sri Lanka as well. So if you look at all of this, some way or the other, these countries are bound to or are forced to also stay away or take decisions which may not be central to the interests of the sub-regional institutions as well. So that's how China functions, whether it's in terms of its relations with ASEAN. If you see that China has been a divisive issue in ASEAN, in all of its ASEAN meetings as well. So if we characterize that, yes, I would say sub-regional initiatives are important, but how they are placed, in which context they are placed, is even more important, is what I feel. And whether they have agendas which can make a difference in terms of a structure or an organizational setup, or they will just end up being releasing joint declarations and nothing happens after that. Right. So I would say that that needs to be done if it needs to be a very effective initiative or an organization.
Sir, I have one more question. Sir,
Yes.
relating to the trade aspect. So, isn't it ironical that India has established bilateral trade agreements with far-off countries like the UAE, but no such strong bilateral or free trade agreement exists with its neighboring state? And even if it does, like the SAFTA, it is ineffective.
Yes. So yeah, with FTAs, you are right, because like I said, the objective of trade is basically to benefit mutually from what countries can do. And a free trade deal is generally crafted, and if you look at negotiations as well, whether it's with regards to a deal on something like climate change, for instance, or a deal on trade, every country negotiates from the position of its own interests. That's how the international system works. When a country like India tries to be benign in its neighborhood, then other countries think that India is bossing around, to put it more lightly, in a non-academic way. So that's how India has been looked at in its neighborhood. I mean, if you look at it as well, India is the largest economy. India has the maximum resources. And so obviously India will have the major stake. India has the maximum population as well. So India has the maximum stake in the trade in South Asia, and the countries in South Asia do not like this. But accepting the reality will be much better in terms of successful trade negotiations. But like you said rightly as well, geopolitical issues come in the way. If countries like Pakistan are not willing to discuss anything, if Kashmir is not discussed, we cannot move ahead, and the global trade is not going to stop for you if you do not decide to move ahead and take the advantage. And that is why even with sub-regional initiatives, if we look at BIMSTEC, they have a trade component as well. It's rather better to move ahead and enhance relations and then finally come to a place where trade is not happening, and try to negotiate, rather than wait for this to happen and say that I will only trade anywhere else apart from my neighborhood. That is a very closed approach which does not work pretty much in this globalized era of free trade.
Sir, also in balancing the US-China rivalry in the Indo-Pacific, so don't you think India is missing out on its politically bilateral relations with its neighboring states? Because the China factor has been dominating when it comes to establishing relations with our neighboring states.
So yeah, definitely China. We also have to accept the geopolitical reality. China is a much more powerful country. It has much more stronger economy where it can provide aid and assistance much more to the countries than what India can. But in the study of geopolitics, which I have also been studying for more than a decade, you can do whatever you want, but you cannot change geography. That's how it is. So if India neighbors Sri Lanka, the first responder to any crisis in Sri Lanka is going to be India. It's now going to be China. And if China does not benefit, China is going to think twice before offering any type of an assistance. And this was very much clear when we saw the whole crisis in Sri Lanka. India was the first country to respond, and India is the maximum aid providing country to Sri Lanka. It is China is trying to now come and say we will provide aid, but probably when it was most required, it was India. So that's the thing about geopolitics. You can't change it. So how much ever we have an Indo-Pacific policy or anything else, we might benefit from that. We might outreach, but no power in history has been successful without having sustained or being a major power in its neighborhood, whether it's China, United States. You look at this in history and you will find out. Without your neighboring countries supporting this point of view of you enhancing your relationship. But the only thing is that the United States did not have any threat historically from Canada. It had subdued Mexico, or South America was brought under the Monroe Doctrine early on. So it did not see any threat from its own region. Whereas then you look at China. China had historically sort of seen this region in a more hierarchical manner. And now it has sort of it exercises force more often and more easily. In the South China Sea is the best example to see how it does. So either through force or through policy, countries have to acknowledge the strength of the major power in its neighborhood. And India, I feel, is much more benevolent in terms of its approach towards its neighborhood. It does not impose. But that advantage is obviously taken on by countries like China. So for us to then go into formulating a policy in our extended neighborhood, it helps balance of this deficiency in our neighborhood as well. So if you look at India's relations and China's, like I said in the talk, China has sort of a perception that India's Act East policy is targeted towards China. And obviously, India has its own interests. India has its own geopolitical interests now through the Indo-Pacific, which is reflected. But so be it. I mean, what's wrong? If China does the same thing, we should do the same thing. I mean, there is nothing should stop us from pursuing our interests in any part of the world. So,
thank you so much.
Yeah.
Any other question? Please go ahead. Be quick. There should be a lot more questions on a subject which is of tropical interest. So, Dr. Ram, I would like to speak to you now.
Sure.
And I have few queries, as I said,
Sure.
that I received from various sources. You have very rightly pointed out that it all started with a economic cooperation with Asian countries. Now it has evolved into more into strategic cooperation. I mean, that is something a new development, and I think is going to be in India's favor. I am reminded of China's objection to India. I mean, moving in this area. Southeast Asia or East Asia. I am reminded when I visited China in 2014, there was an international conference. And there were international participants as well as for each session there was a Chinese counterpart scholar. I mean, there was one subject for a session where you will have an international scholar outside China and one Chinese scholar. I don't know how they were going to balance that, conference and all that. So I met several Chinese scholars, young and senior and all that, they were having only one refrain, that what India has got to do? Why should India come to this area? What interest is going to serve if it enters? Because they say that by doing this, I mean, they are just serving a U.S. interest. And India should not align with the US. I mean, this was a common refrain with all the Chinese scholars that India. So I told them that please, we don't believe in military alignments and all that, and be sure that we are not for or against any major power. We want coordination with China also. It can't be one-sided affair. It has got to be reciprocal and all that. If they expect us to do something, then we also expect China to do something which is friendly to us. But that has not been the case. So this is China's objection and all that. And we are happy to know that, as you have pointed out, from economic cooperation, now it has become more relevant to have strategic cooperation with these countries of Asian, and we can have BIMSTEC and all that. There could be additional, forums for cooperation with our neighboring states. But we can't deny that the advantage that we have with Asian countries is something which we can't think of with any other multilateral forum in this area. And secondly, China has been very clever in dealing with these Asian countries or this multilateral organization. They, deal with them multilaterally, collectively, at a level, and then they also handle these countries individually also. They said that we have our individual problems and we will solve it. So they've been very clever about that, and they're trying to maintain their position, and so that these countries do not go outside their sphere of influence and all that. And as you had pointed out, that cultural diplomacy can play a very vital role in promoting our relations with the countries of Southeast Asia. And a lot of efforts have been made. A lot of schemes have been launched, festivals and people-to-people contact and all that is there. I think that is also going to play a great role in enhancing our relations with these countries and all that. And so far as the South Asian countries are concerned, economic relations are as vital as anything. I mean, if we have to handle with this, the China trade deficit, and then we have to have some other sources out. And I think the economies of these South Asian countries and India, they complement each other. I mean, we can fulfill their certain requirements. They can also fulfill our certain requirements. So it goes both way, and we hope that it will going to move in the right direction. And the changes that we made in 2014, India's Act East, and I think the policy was always there. That is started in national, but now there is more emphasis on how we should move forward, and it is a question of perception. I think we are more focused. We don't say that it is India's East Asia policy. Now we say that it is Act East policy. So every government, they coin these, terms to show a change in perception of the government of the day, that how diplomatically we are going to handle all these problems. So thank you very much, Dr. Ram, for having this wonderful session and clarifying many issues that come to our mind and of the students so far as India's engagement with the South Asian countries. So thank you very much, and I just hope that we will have, whenever a question arises, we may trouble you and ask you to come.
No, it's my pleasure. I mean, this is an area which I have been focusing on for, like I said, quite a bit of time, and even my PhD was on looking at the whole geopolitics in Southeast Asia, and looking at how ASEAN as an organization has been interacting with major powers in Southeast Asia. So this is something pretty much closely I've been looking at, and I'll be happy to share anytime in the future as well.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you
Thank
very
you.
much. And with
Thank you.
your consent and permission, now I would like to close this session. And
Thank you.
just a